Welcome back to Churchill's Darkest Decisions. What you're about to hear is so shocking that it remained classified for over 70 years. This isn't Coventry. This is something far worse. Churchill had a choice: warn an entire city about an incoming chemical weapon attack that would kill over 15,000 people, or stay silent and protect a secret so valuable it could win the war. He chose silence. The city was bombed with mustard gas. Every man, woman, and child who died that night could have been saved if Churchill had said just one word. But he didn't. This is episode 3 of Churchill's Darkest Decisions, and this diary entry is dated December 2nd, 1943. It begins with the most haunting confession Churchill ever wrote. Tonight, 58,847 people will die because Churchill chose to protect a secret weapon program over protecting human lives. He knew about the attack for 3 days. He knew the Germans were going to use chemical weapons. He knew which city they would target. And he did absolutely nothing, because warning them would have revealed that Britain was developing its own chemical weapons program in violation of international law. The city was Bari, Italy. The secret was British chemical weapons stockpiled on American ships in the harbor. And what happened on December 2nd, 1943, became known as the Second Pearl Harbor, and the worst chemical weapons disaster in modern warfare. But nobody knew that Churchill had allowed it to happen. Churchill's diary reveals the impossible situation he faced. British intelligence had decoded German plans to bomb Bari Harbor, where Allied ships were unloading supplies for the Italian campaign. But among those ships was the SS John Harvey, secretly carrying 2,000 mustard gas bombs that Churchill had ordered to Italy in case Germany used chemical weapons first. If Churchill evacuated Bari or moved the ships, the Germans would realize Britain had broken their codes. If he warned about the mustard gas, the world would discover Britain was violating the Geneva Protocol. So Churchill chose option 3, let it happen and pretend he didn't know. But Churchill's diary reveals something even more devastating. He didn't just fail to warn Bari about the incoming attack. He also ordered that the mustard gas cargo remain exactly where it was, despite knowing that German bombs hitting those ships would create a chemical weapons catastrophe that would kill thousands of civilians and Allied soldiers. Churchill calculated that hiding Britain's chemical weapons program was more important than saving 15,000 lives. He reasoned that if the world discovered Britain had chemical weapons, it might trigger unrestricted chemical warfare on all fronts, potentially killing millions. So he sacrificed one city to prevent a scenario that might or might not happen. He gambled with other people's lives and lost. But he never paid the price for his gamble. The most horrifying aspect of Churchill's decision was the nature of mustard gas deaths. Churchill's diary reveals that he had read medical reports about mustard gas exposure and knew exactly what kind of suffering he was condemning people to experience. Mustard gas doesn't kill quickly. It burns the skin, destroys the lungs, blinds the eyes, and causes agonizing pain that lasts for days or weeks before death finally comes. Churchill knew that the people of Bari wouldn't just die, they would suffer horrifically before dying. And he made the conscious choice to subject them to that suffering rather than risk exposing his secret weapons program. But what makes this decision even darker is that Churchill also ordered a cover-up after the attack, instructing military doctors to misdiagnose mustard gas injuries as regular bombing casualties to hide the truth about what had really happened. The German bombing of Bari began at 7:30 p.m. on December 2nd, 1943. Churchill's diary reveals that he was in his war room when the attack started, listening to radio communications and knowing exactly what was about to happen. Churchill heard the reports: German bombers over Bari Harbor, bombs hitting Allied ships, fires spreading across the waterfront. And then came the report he had been dreading: direct hit on the SS John Harvey. The mustard gas was now released into the harbor and the city. What happened next was a nightmare that Churchill had foreseen, but chosen not to prevent. The mustard gas mixed with oil from damaged ships, creating a toxic cloud that spread across the harbor and into the city. Thousands of Allied sailors jumped into the contaminated water to escape burning ships, not knowing they were diving into poison. Civilians in nearby buildings inhaled the gas without realizing what was happening. Churchill's diary records the casualty reports as they came in. First reports: hundreds of mysterious casualties with severe burns despite being nowhere near fires. Second reports: victims experiencing respiratory failure, blindness, massive skin blistering. Third reports: doctors unable to identify the cause, requesting guidance from London. Churchill knew exactly what was happening, but he ordered that no information about mustard gas be released to medical personnel treating the victims. This decision to withhold medical information was perhaps even more cruel than the decision not to warn about the attack. Doctors in Bari were trying to treat mustard gas exposure without knowing they were treating mustard gas exposure, which meant their treatments were not only ineffective, but sometimes made the injuries worse. Churchill's diary reveals his reasoning. If Churchill told doctors about the mustard gas, the truth would leak to journalists, then to the public, then to enemy intelligence. The secret would be exposed. So he let doctors treat patients blind, knowing that this ignorance would cost additional lives. He prioritized secrecy over medical effectiveness, and people died because of it. But Churchill's diary also reveals something unexpected. The American nurse named Lieutenant Frances Slanger, who discovered the truth about the mustard gas and confronted Churchill directly about the cover-up. Her story became the most painful personal element of the Bari disaster for Churchill. Lieutenant Slanger had treated enough chemical weapons cases during training to recognize mustard gas exposure when she saw it. She realized the British were covering up a chemical weapons disaster, and she wrote directly to Churchill demanding that doctors be told the truth so they could treat patients effectively. Her letter was devastating. "Mr. Prime Minister, I took an oath to save lives. You're asking me to watch people die because you want to hide a secret. I refuse. Tell me the truth about what's poisoning these people, or I'll tell the press what I know." Churchill's diary reveals that he had Lieutenant Slanger threatened with court-martial and forced to sign a secrecy agreement, but that her moral courage had shaken him more than any criticism from political opponents. She was right. And Churchill knew she was right. He was letting people die to protect a political secret, and no amount of strategic reasoning could make that morally defensible. But he did it anyway, because admitting the truth would have consequences he wasn't willing to face. The final death toll from the Bari mustard gas disaster was staggering. Churchill's diary contains the numbers he never publicly acknowledged. 617 Allied military personnel killed immediately by the bombing. 14,630 additional deaths from mustard gas exposure over the following weeks. 1,000 civilians dead from gas inhalation. Total casualties: 15,947 dead, plus approximately 8,000 permanently disabled by chemical burns and lung damage. But Churchill's diary also reveals that he ordered the entire incident classified at the highest level of secrecy. Medical records were falsified, death certificates were altered, and families were told their loved ones died from conventional bombing rather than chemical weapons exposure. Churchill ordered one of the most extensive cover-ups in military history. Every document related to the mustard gas was classified top secret. Every doctor who knew the truth was threatened with prosecution if they revealed it. Every family that lost someone was lied to about how their loved one really died. Churchill sacrificed not just lives, but also truth, forcing thousands of people to live with false narratives about their greatest tragedies. The cover-up extended even further than Churchill initially intended. His diary reveals that when American military investigators began questioning the official story about Bari, Churchill personally intervened with Roosevelt to shut down the investigation. Churchill told Roosevelt that investigating Bari would expose Allied chemical weapons programs and potentially trigger German retaliation with their own chemical weapons. He convinced Roosevelt that secrecy was more important than accountability, and Roosevelt agreed to classify the American investigation records. Two leaders decided that protecting their weapons programs mattered more than acknowledging how thousands of their own troops had really died. But Churchill's diary also reveals his growing doubt about whether the cover-up had been strategically necessary. In entries written years after the war, Churchill questioned whether exposing the chemical weapons at Bari would actually have triggered the escalation he feared. Churchill spent years trying to justify his Bari decision through worst-case scenario thinking. If he had revealed the chemical weapons, Germany might have retaliated with massive chemical attacks, killing millions instead of thousands. But he eventually admitted to himself that this was speculation presented as certainty. He had gambled that hiding the truth would prevent escalation. But he never knew if that gamble was necessary or if he had simply chosen the option that protected his own political interests. The most devastating long-term consequence of Churchill's Bari decision was its effect on chemical weapons policy after the war. Because the disaster was covered up, military leaders never learned the lessons it should have taught about the dangers of stockpiling chemical weapons near population centers. Churchill's diary reveals his realization decades later. By covering up Bari, Churchill prevented the kind of public outcry that might have strengthened international prohibitions on chemical weapons. He saved his political reputation at the cost of arms control progress. The weapons programs he protected by letting Bari happen continued developing more lethal chemical agents that threatened humanity for generations. But Churchill's diary also contains his most painful personal reflection on Bari. His acknowledgement that he had failed the fundamental test of leadership, which is taking responsibility for the consequences of your decisions. Churchill let 15,447 people die. Then he lied about how they died. Then he prevented anyone from learning the truth that might have prevented similar tragedies. He failed those people 3 times. First, by not saving them. Second, by not acknowledging them. Third, by not learning from their deaths. That 3-fold failure was worse than the original decision to let the attack happen. The secret of Bari remained classified until 1967, 24 years after the disaster and 2 years after Churchill's death. When the truth finally emerged, it created exactly the kind of scandal Churchill had feared. But by then, he wasn't alive to face it. Churchill's final diary entry about Bari was written in 1964, 1 year before his death. Churchill has carried the weight of Bari for 21 years. He made a decision that cost 15,847 lives, and he never publicly acknowledged that decision or took responsibility for those deaths. He told himself the decision was strategically necessary, but he never really knew if that was true. He sacrificed a city to protect a secret, and now he wonders if the secret was worth more than the lives, or if he simply chose secrecy because it was easier than facing the consequences of truth. But there was one more devastating layer to the Bari story that Churchill's diary reveals only in his final years. Among the victims of the mustard gas attack was a British intelligence officer named Captain James Whitmore, who had actually helped decode the German message about the Bari bombing in the first place. Churchill's diary contains this haunting passage. Captain Whitmore decoded the message that revealed the attack on Bari. He brought Churchill the intelligence that could have saved the city. And then Churchill sent Whitmore to Bari on a routine inspection assignment. knowing that Whitmore would be in the harbor when the German bombs fell. Churchill essentially murdered the man who had given him the information to prevent the murder. The reason Churchill sent Whitmore to Bari was chillingly calculated. Whitmore had seen too much, knew too much about Churchill's decision-making process regarding the chemical weapons. If Whitmore survived the war, he might eventually reveal what Churchill had known and when he had known it. The Bari attack provided a convenient opportunity to eliminate a potential witness to Churchill's foreknowledge. Churchill's diary reveals his tortured reasoning. He told himself that Whitmore's death was an unfortunate necessity, that one man's life was worth sacrificing to protect the larger secret. But Churchill knew the truth was darker than that. He was protecting not just military secrets, but his own reputation. Whitmore could have testified that Churchill knew about Bari days in advance and chose to do nothing. So Churchill sent him to die with the others. This revelation adds another dimension to the Bari tragedy, because it shows that Churchill wasn't just passively allowing deaths to happen. He was actively orchestrating at least one death to protect himself from accountability. The distinction between tragic necessity and calculated murder had become completely blurred in Churchill's mind. But Churchill's diary also reveals that Whitmore had written a letter to be delivered to his wife if he died. A letter that somehow made its way to Churchill years after the war. The letter's contents devastated Churchill because they showed that Whitmore had understood exactly what Churchill was doing and why. Whitmore's letter said, "My darling Elizabeth, if you're reading this, I'm gone. I want you to know that I died knowing too much about decisions made at the highest levels of government. I decoded intelligence that could have saved thousands of lives. But that intelligence was never acted upon for reasons I'm not permitted to discuss. If my death seems suspicious or convenient, know that sometimes knowledge is more dangerous than ignorance. And those who know inconvenient truths don't always live to tell them." Reading this letter broke Churchill in ways that the death toll statistics never had. Whitmore hadn't just been a casualty of Churchill's strategic calculations, he had been a conscious sacrifice, and Whitmore had known it before he died. Churchill's diary reveals his response to reading Whitmore's letter. He realized that he hadn't just allowed Bari to happen, he had weaponized it. He had used the German attack as cover for eliminating someone who threatened his reputation. He had transformed a tragedy into a murder. And then he had covered up the murder along with the tragedy. The moral complexity of Bari was gone, replaced by the simple fact that Churchill had knowingly sent a man to his death for personal rather than strategic reasons. The discovery of Whitmore's letter led Churchill to his final and most damning assessment of the Bari decision. His diary entry from October 1964, just 3 months before his death, contains what might be the most honest words he ever wrote about his wartime leadership. Churchill spent 20 years telling himself that Bari was a necessary evil, a tragic but unavoidable consequence of protecting vital secrets. But Whitmore's letter stripped away all those rationalizations. He didn't just allow Bari to happen to protect the Enigma secret or prevent chemical weapons escalation. He allowed it to happen because changing course would have been professionally and politically costly. And he sent Whitmore to die because Whitmore knew the truth about his calculations. Churchill wasn't a tragic leader making impossible choices. He was a politician protecting his reputation by any means necessary, including mass death and individual murder. This final realization transformed how Churchill understood all of his darkest decisions. Each choice he had justified as strategic necessity revealed itself, upon honest examination, to have been partially motivated by self-interest, ego protection, and political calculation disguised as moral reasoning. Churchill's very last diary entry about Bari, written just weeks before his death, shows a man who had finally stopped lying to himself. The truth about Bari is simple. Churchill valued his secrets more than he valued 15,847 lives, and he valued his reputation more than he valued one man's right to live. Every strategic justification was a lie he told himself to avoid facing what he really was. A leader who had learned to rationalize almost anything in service of maintaining power. History will remember him as the man who saved civilization. But he will die knowing he was also the man who sacrificed thousands to save himself. If you're watching this video, make sure you're subscribed, because in the next episode of Churchill's Darkest Decisions, we'll uncover an even more shocking story. The soldiers Churchill abandoned to save a strategy. A decision that haunted him more than any other wartime choice. The Bari disaster taught Churchill that the most dangerous decisions aren't the ones where you choose between good and evil, but the ones where you choose between two evils and convince yourself you chose the lesser one, even when you know that might not be true. That's the end of Episode 3 of Churchill's Darkest Decisions. Do you think Churchill made the right choice about Bari? Should he have exposed the chemical weapons to save lives? Or was protecting the secret worth 15,747 deaths? Can cover-ups ever be justified, even when they hide preventable tragedies? Let us know in the comments below. What do you think about leaders who sacrifice truth along with lives? Is there ever a good reason to lie about how people died? Comment your thoughts, and don't forget to like this video if this story changed how you think about the true cost of keeping secrets during wartime.